Hello students, this is module 6.1.6, continuing in superclass Tetrapoda, class Aves. The slide you see before you shows the fossil form Archaeopteryx. Now Archaeopteryx, here's the name right up here in the upper right corner, it actually means ancient wing, and this is a form that is intermediate between reptiles and between birds. So a not missing link. And of course, with the term missing link is not used by scientists, it's better to call it an intermediate form. And we actually have a fossil cast that looks very much like this. It's made out of a fiberglass or some kind of resin. It's not fiberglass, but some kind of resin. You can see it in the classroom. Here is a line drawing of that, has feather impressions. And here is a chicken skeleton for comparison. And this is an artist reconstruction of this form. Notice that it has teeth and it doesn't have a beak. It has fingers on its wings. It also has a long bony tail. And so Archaeopteryx here in this little table on the left, it's kind of hard to understand. It uses some double negatives. It says Archaeopteryx lacks a toothless beak, so it has teeth. It lacks a keeled sternum. The breastbone of birds has a blade out in front that's called the keel, and that's used for surface area for attachment of flight muscles. Archaeopteryx does not have that. Archaeopteryx lacks no claws on their wings, so it has claws on the wings. It doesn't have a fused tail. It has individual vertebrae in its tail. And Archaeopteryx has flight, a backward-pointing pubis. It has an enlarged sternum. It has feathers, three-fingered hand, wishbone, fused clavicles called a furcula. It has hollow bones like birds. It has a long index finger like birds. It has a bipedal gait, walks on two legs like birds and dinosaurs. Has legs directly underneath the body and has a hinge-like ankle, as do birds. So it's just an interesting form with which to begin our study of the class Aves, which is a class that has birds. The Latin for Aves is birds, and the common name here is birds. And virtually no one has any problem identifying a bird. The majority of features in this class are geared toward increasing the strength while decreasing the weight for flight. These are seemingly contradictory goals, but birds have done admirably well in becoming lighter and stronger. Birds have their forelimbs modified as wings with feathers. The feathers are made out of keratin. Keratin is the same protein out of which reptile scales are made, and feathers are derived from those scales. As a matter of fact, birds still have scales on their legs. Birds have a beak without teeth, although they may have an egg tooth, a small little structure on top of the beak that helps them to break out of the egg. Birds have a cloaca, and their excretory waste product is uric acid, the non-toxic, energetically expensive form that's kind of a white crystalline waste. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. Birds have pneumatic bones. That means air-filled bones, and they have many fused bones. Just as an example, there's a bird called a frigate bird, not a friggin' bird, but a frigate bird, F-R-I-G-A-T-E. The frigate bird, if you take all of its feathers and all of its bones, its feathers weigh more than its bones. It's really pretty amazing. And the fact of the matter is that the bones are not simply hollow, but they have all these little cross walls inside that increase the strength while also allowing the weight to be decreased. So relatively strong. We don't really see that in chicken leg bones, for example, but in other birds we do if we cut the bone open. The bird skeleton also has a lot of fusion. This creates rigidity and strength. Birds are the first group of vertebrates that we've studied whose members are all endothermic, meaning that you might use the term warm-blooded, but this simply means that the birds get the energy for their body temperature from their own metabolism. And birds typically have a relatively high metabolism. A typical body temperature for a bird the size of a sparrow is 105, 106 degrees, so warmer than a human. All birds have a four-chambered heart, so they have complete separation of the systemic loop going to the body and the pulmonary loop going to the lungs. They have a land egg, and it's very much like the land egg that we showed you for the reptiles. The major difference is in the shell. In the reptiles, the shell would be proteinaceous, or made out of protein and kind of leathery. In the birds, the shell is made out of calcium carbonate and is hard and brittle. It has many small pores in it. There are about 30 different groups or orders of birds. The most diverse group are the perching birds, which is order Passeriformes. The largest perching birds are like ravens, and some of the tiny ones are little birds smaller than sparrows, so quite interesting. So let's look at a couple of features about birds. One thing we can learn about is bird feces, our bird droppings. In fact, a bird dropping is more than feces. And here's a question in the upper right. A bird wants to buy this car. How can you tell? It made a deposit. Sorry about that. Anyway, if you look at a bird dropping, the white part is actually urine. It's uric acid, and the dark part is feces. Remember, birds have a cloaca, and when they go to the bathroom, they go number 1 and number 2 at the same time. So now you know all about bird droppings. So there you go. A real important aspect of bird biology has to do with their beaks and feet. Because their wings are adapted, because their wings are used for flight, they can't be used to handle food. And so if we want to understand how a bird fits in its habitat and fills its niche, what it eats, we need to look at its beak. And so birders often look at beaks. These are some quite exotic beaks here. This is a large hornbill, and it's a big bill for eating fruit. Here's a kind of a general purpose bill, a probing insect eating, could even eat some seeds. Here is a raptorial bill on an eagle that would tear flesh. Here's a fish catching bill on a kingfisher. Here's another fruit eating bill on a toucan. Here's a kind of an interesting beak. This is on a shrike. It's kind of a perching bird that's adapted a predaceous habit, so it's also a raptorial bill. But it's just interesting to see some examples. And here's some birds' feet as well. Now remember, birds do not have heavy teeth. Don't you love Photoshop? Here's an ostrich with a dog's mouth inserted in it. But birds don't have heavy teeth. Just think of a goose with its long neck, and if it had teeth out there. Teeth are the densest material in most animal bodies, and so it would create a lot of weight out there and upset the center of gravity, which is really important for flight. And so as a result, birds have light bills. Looking back at these beaks, you might think that the hornbill or the toucan, because they have large beaks, are really heavy. They are very light. I was able to handle skulls of both of these, and they're amazingly light, those beaks. Here's just some photographs of birds. Here's one of our little local birds. This is a Say's phoebe. It's a member of the flycatcher family, and I like this little bird. It's a tough little bird that doesn't necessarily fly south for the winter. They hang around over winter here, and so you have to admire that. When all the others fly south to find insects, these guys tough it out and eat berries and scrounge around and make it. Here's a bird of paradise from New Guinea. We saw some of those in the Deep Jungle video. On the right is the smallest falcon in North America. It's called the American kestrel. And these are neat birds. They will hover in place, and they eat mostly grasshoppers and rodents. Occasionally they'll eat a small bird. Another nickname for them is sparrowhawks, because they are small. Here, this beautiful bird is a lilac roller. These occur in the Old World, Africa, and up into Europe, Southern Europe. And it's a group, an order of birds that we don't see in North America. Here's a prairie falcon. And in the lower right is a whooping crane, a very rare bird. And one last thing that we can talk about before we leave the birds, this little introduction, is really very brief. If you want to learn how to bird watch, this is not the place we're going to do that. But we want to talk about bird nests, because sometimes people are confused. They think that all birds sleep in nests each night, and that's just not true. The majority of birds simply roost in a tree somewhere, and so they just sit up there in the tree. Sometimes birds will tuck their head under their wing. They will actually do this. But often they just sit up there. There are some birds, however, that do sleep in nests. And here in the lower left is a state bird of Arizona, the cactus wren, and they typically have several nests like this, a little bit larger than a football. This one is actually in a cholla cactus, but they'll build them in different trees and mesquite trees, and I've even seen them in pine trees and olive trees in landscaping around town. But they build several of them, and they sleep in a different one on different nights, and they'll actually lay eggs in just one in the breeding season. In the upper left is an eagle eyrie. That's what they call a nest. An eagle's nest has a chick there. These are usually built in dead trees called snags, and year after year they add sticks, and eventually the tree will deteriorate or decompose, and the nest will break. Hopefully there's no eggs or young in it, but it happens sometimes. In the top center, those blue eggs are robin eggs, and so that's robin egg blue. In the top right, we can see a peregrine falcon. A peregrine falcon's one of the fastest birds in the world. It dives at like 200 miles an hour, and they nest up in the Huachuca Mountains. They were very endangered because of DDT, as were bald eagles were formerly much rare. But the peregrine falcons have made a comeback, and I've seen them a number of times, maybe around town, and I've seen them on the bypass, seen them on Charleston Road. I even saw one in my neighborhood a couple times. The lower right, this little nondescript grayish brown bird, it's called the bush tit, and they are in family flocks. And this nest is very long. The nest is longer than the photograph that's cut off. But these nests are used for sleeping, and there will be 10 or 12 members of the same little flock in there. They'll come tumbling out. They're actually neat little birds, related to chickadees and others. In the bottom center is an odd bird from Australia. It's called a mallee fowl, sometimes called a bush turkey. And that's its nest, that big mound of vegetation, and the bird has made this, and it will actually decompose. It's kind of like a compost pile, and as it decomposes, it heats up the eggs. So this is like a natural incubator. And so if the eggs are too warm, the bird actually sticks its wrists down in there and feels how warm it is. If it's too warm, it'll take off some vegetation so there's not as much decomposition. If it's too cool, it'll pile more onto the eggs. So it's really quite a interesting nesting system. With that, we're going to conclude this introduction to the birds.